All right, welcome into the latest edition of the Second Half Draft Show. I'm your host, Juice, and flying solo for this evening's show. Free agency frenzy, right? The 2026 NFL new league year has begun, and there's been a ton of headline grabbing transactions to this point. The Maxx Crosby trade that was, of course, we got starting quarterbacks in the 2025 season now playing for new teams, Tua, Geno Smith, Kyler Murray, and then a litany of other transactions, including trades as well. So we're going to dive right into it. I'm going to go team by team and give my thoughts in terms of how each team has done based on the moves they've made thus far, whether it come in the form of trades or, of course, free agent signings. The new league year is underway. Of course, there's a legal tampering period that started at noon Eastern on Monday. Flurry of moves right out the gate. First wave of free agency is done. We'll see a second wave. We're seeing some nice short-term prove-it type deals, but shrewd moves by a few teams. So I'm going to go over all 32 teams and what they've done thus far this offseason, and also give an idea as to how I think that will impact their draft approach, right? Which is obviously the crux of this channel, the Second Half Draft Show. The focus is the NFL draft, but free agency has a tendency to impact what each team does in the draft. So let's jump into it. All right. And we're going to leverage CBS's sports free agency tracker. Been kind of testing the waters with a few. NFL.com obviously does a great job, but I'm going to give CBS Sports a little love here, and we'll peruse each team's moves thus far, starting with the Arizona Cardinals. And as I see it, the top two names in particular stand out to me: Isaac Seumalo, formerly of the Eagles, and then, of course, Tyler Algier, who backed up Bijan Robinson in Atlanta. I like both of these moves. The Cardinals clearly had work to do along the offensive line. The offensive line is the most important position group as far as I'm concerned. So we're anticipating, obviously, with Kyler Murray moving on, either it being Jacoby Brissett or perhaps a rookie. And then the only other rookie that I have really linked to the Cardinals at this point is Ty Simpson. And that's going to be a continuous conversation leading up all throughout the draft, whether or not Ty Simpson is a top 20 pick, or does he slide into the bottom of the first round? I do believe he's going to go first round, although I do have my fair share of questions about him. The only quarterback that has a first round grade as it relates to this particular draft class is Fernando Mendoza out of Indiana. But Simpson, in the right situation, I think can be effective. I don't know that the Cardinals currently, as currently formed, is the right situation, but you got to start somewhere. That said, I'm prepared. If I'm the Cardinals brass, obviously it's a new coaching staff there in Arizona, I'm prepared to start Jacoby Brissett. If I happen to work out a deal that allows me to select Ty Simpson as well, of course they have the third overall pick, but I don't know that Ty Simpson is worth that selection. Quarterbacks tend to get overdrafted. I understand that, but there are so many other areas of this team that need to be addressed, and better players, frankly. Quarterback being the most important single individual position, but I wouldn't force the issue. So, again, the way Brissett acquitted himself last year, once he took over for Kyler Murray, was fairly impressive. I think they've taken a couple of nice steps here in terms of kind of solidifying that offense. You got James Conner coming off of injury. You match him up with Algier, both kind of bigger, bruising type backs, but that seems to be the way they want to approach things on the offensive side of the ball as far as their run game is concerned. Algier's a nice compliment. You know, you may not necessarily get much of a departure from Connor as far as skill set is concerned, but Algier being a younger player, clean bill of health, a lot of tread on those tires. Clearly, the fact that they re-upped with Connor, at least that's my understanding. I could be wrong, but I believe they re-upped with Connor. Suggests that they're not very high in terms of this running back class, right? They will have an opportunity to select Jeremiah Love if they are so inclined. I just don't know that, again, this team is necessarily ready to use a high draft pick on a running back. You typically want the rest of the team to be, from a roster perspective, situated before you add a running back to the mix. You want to take full advantage of that rookie contract. I don't know that the Cardinals are there just yet. So they go with Algier. Roy Lopez adds to that defensive down line. And then, of course, Kendrick Bourne, I think, is a sneaky good add as well. He was added considering the litany of injuries that the 49ers had on the offensive side of the ball within their receiving room. He played rather well. And every time Kendrick Bourne gets an opportunity, he plays well. He's not a number one. He's not a number two, although he may have one of those types of games or a couple of those types of games this season. but a good third option, really fourth option in the passing game, because you have Harrison, you have Wilson, who broke out last year, and of course you have Trey McBride at tight end, who had a remarkable year, set a single season record in terms of receptions for tight end. So they have the makings of a good offense. I think they use that third overall pick either on the offensive line or perhaps edge rusher, but they're probably a offensive tackle away to really feeling a pretty solid offense. Okay, let's move on to the Atlanta Falcons. And I think you got to start with the trade to acquire Tua from Miami. So, of course, Tua Tagovailoa fell out of favor, has dealt with a rash of injuries. There's a new brain trust, new front office, new head coach, Jeff Hafley now there in Miami. They're deciding to go in a very different direction. We'll get to the Dolphins in a moment here in terms of what they did at quarterback via free agency. But Tua was let go. He had a lot of money owed to him. In fact, I believe it's even as designated as a post June 1 cut, it's $99 million worth of dead cap. That's a significant amount of money. I know the NFL salary cap for each team is, I think, around 230 million. To have effectively $100 million worth of your cap, frozen, unallocated because you owe money to a player who's no longer on your roster is a tough pill to swallow. But they just ripped the Band-Aid off. They decided not to kick that can down the road. They just decided, you know what, fresh start. We're gonna make do. We're gonna try to work this thing as best we can and move on. So Tua ends up in Atlanta, and of course, Atlanta's young quarterback Michael Penix, whom I'm a big fan of, has dealt with his fair share of injuries. In fact, he has probably a more lengthy injury history than Tua, going back to his days in college. There's a new coaching staff in Atlanta. Lot of movement in terms of coaches. So the the front office, of course, you got Matt Ryan now part of the front office there in Atlanta. The front office's coaching staff, they did not select Michael Penix. They did not draft Michael Penix. So they're not going to have the same level, I would imagine, same level of, they're not as invested in Penix. So my expectation, albeit I do expect Penix to win the job, is that there will be a bit of a competition. There will be a bit of a competition, right? To assign on the veteran minimum because, again, he's being paid handsomely by the Dolphins despite not being on that roster anymore. That's just the way it works. But I expect the competition, and assuming clean bill of health for Penix, I imagine he'll win. The arm talent is superior to Tua. They'll both be in the same boat in terms of learning a new offense, but I just think Penix is a more talented player. And despite the lengthy injury history of Penix, he doesn't have a history of concussions, whereas Tua does. And that obviously looms big. But not a bad situation. If you go into the 2026 year with a healthy Michael Penix and Tua backing him up, that's not a bad quarterback room at all. The Jahan Dotson addition, I thought, was a good one for only 7.5 million per season. And I say only because, of course, we're talking about professional football. That's a really good receiver. The former number one pick. He burst on the scene in Washington and then kind of fell out of favor. Played a couple seasons there in Philadelphia behind AJ Brown and of course Devontae Smith. I think he has a real opportunity with Darnell Mooney moving on to carve himself out that second option in the passing game, or perhaps tertiary option with Kyle Pitts signing his franchise tag, but certainly playing opposite Drake London. I think Dotson can turn some heads. He's a talented player. He's still a young player. I think he's really just entering his prime. So the Falcons got a good addition there via free agency. Nick Folk, the Falcons have had issues with their kicking game. Younghoe Koo struggled, was released. They've had kind of a litany of different kickers over the course of last season. Nick Folk has been very steady, although he's towards the end of his career. Kickers obviously can play very long time, and kicking in that New York, or rather New Jersey weather, in the elements, he did a great job. So bringing him in, now he's going to be kicking in that controlled environment at least 8 times a season. And then, of course, they play Tampa Bay down in Florida, so it should be pretty good weather there, assuming it's not raining. And then the Saints in their dome. So really good situation from that point. Austin Hooper started his career in Atlanta. Now he's back. I think, considering the concerns around James Pierce, right? And of course, he's coming off a rookie season where he got double-digit sacks, and it's seemingly they figured out the pass rush. It's been an area that has been ailing these Falcons for an extended period of time, and they managed to bring in the right pieces. But Pierce is facing some legal challenges, so they bring in Cameron Thomas, Aziz Ojulari. I expect them to be part of the rotation. I believe A.B. Ketty is now in Washington, so definitely need to replenish. But there's a young group of pass rushers, whether it be at the edge or down line, including my guy Brandon Dorless, Jalon Walker, that really did a great job. But Pierce is a big part of that process. They need him back, so we'll see what happens on that front. Okay. Moving right along, we got the Baltimore Ravens, and this is where we obviously have to talk about the Maxx Crosby trade. So the Ravens in desperate need of pass rush, right? This is a team that's right on the cusp, trying to break through, get to that AFC Championship game, make a run at a Super Bowl, get Lamar back healthy. Of course, this is the third team in a row here now that had a coaching change, and of course, John Harbaugh had been in Baltimore for 20 years, effectively 20 years. He's now in New York coaching the Giants. They made the big deal to trade for Maxx Crosby, which surprised me. Not that the Ravens made the deal, but the fact that they met the Raiders' asking price. So Crosby coming off a meniscus tear, you get two first-round picks, one in 2026, one in 2027. Of course, Crosby does a great job getting after the quarterback. He's tremendous in the run game. He's exactly what they need. But coming off of an injury, I thought perhaps teams would play hardball, and everybody else seemingly did except the Ravens. The Ravens said, you know what, screw it, we're going to do it. And of course, the Ravens then backed out of the trade when Crosby failed his physical. Now, everybody had to know. Everybody had to know. Crosby was playing on that torn meniscus towards the end of the 2025 season. He's only a few months past that. He's still rehabbing. Everybody has to know that he's not going to pass that physical, right? All the reports suggest the Raiders were very straightforward and forthcoming with respect to all of the medical details and where he's at in the recovery process or whatever the case may be. I think ultimately what happened was one of two things. The Ravens staff, their medical staff, got a chance to take a look at it and thought to themselves, it's probably not the worth the risk, or perhaps more likely, Trey Hendrickson, who's a very good pass rusher in his own right, not the same run defender, but certainly can get after the quarterback, and that's ultimately what the Ravens need. Could be had at a cheaper price, right? That 4 years, $112 million, but you're not having to give up either of those first round picks in either 2026 or 2027. I think that was probably part of the motivation, but I could be wrong. Maybe the Ravens medical staff saw something in those reports and those records that gave them pause. So Crosby remains with the Raiders, and he did such a great job in terms of handling this whole process that no bridges have been burned. Of course, the Raiders brass, new coaching staff, new front office, obviously, they can't be pleased with this. They can't be pleased with this. This is effectively the Ravens reneging on the trade, on the transaction, but ultimately, failed physical can effectively void a trade. So here we are. So I mentioned Trey Hendrickson. I can't stress enough how much this move makes. And this is not one of the things that the Ravens typically do. They generally don't trade for players. In fact, they had not traded for a Pro Bowl caliber player in the entire history of this organization. So when the Browns went away and they came back as the Baltimore Ravens, right? From then until just a couple of days ago, they had never made a trade of this type of stature. And of course, it gets voided. So, like I said, streak remains. John Simpson, I thought, was a shrewd addition. 3 years, $30 million. There's been a ton of frustration with former offensive guard Daniel Falele. Now Falele was probably too big, probably played at too big of a weight. He couldn't get to the second level on a consistent basis. There were some runs that should have probably popped for explosive gains that didn't because he wasn't able to get to his mark at the second level. So I know the Ravens fans are very excited about, perhaps an improvement there in the interior of their offensive line. Javon Gwynn gives you some depth in terms of the interior offensive line as well. They re-upped with Tyler Huntley. I think that's a good move. He's obviously familiar, or was familiar, with the offense. We'll see what it looks like here in 2026. But Lamar has struggled with injuries to a certain degree, right? He'll get banged up from time to time. Bring back Awuzie. This comes down, as at least from my perspective, right? Isaiah Likely is now a New York Giant. This comes down to how effective Trey Hendrickson can be and whether or not Simpson can really be that final piece to this offensive line. So that remains to be seen. But those two moves in particular, I think were good moves on behalf of the Ravens. That takes us to the Buffalo Bills. And the Bills were thought to perhaps be very early in the process on Maxx Crosby, but that was dispelled fairly quickly. In fact, the Bears were very much in the Maxx Crosby sweepstakes. And I assumed that DJ Moore would be part of that trade, right? So the Raiders have the first overall pick. For all intents and purposes, the pick is already in. Fernando Mendoza will be the first overall selection. The thought process is you got a young quarterback. You need to fix the offensive line. You need to put weapons around him. You need to create an environment that is conducive to his success. And I thought DJ Moore, certainly with some of the rising receivers in Chicago, Moore's cat figure not necessarily being the most flexible, perhaps it would make sense, right? The Raiders have a ton of cap space. Perhaps it would make sense to get Mendoza an established veteran wideout that can, make plays at every level of the field. Well, the Raiders apparently balked at the contract. They did not like the contract. They didn't want to put themselves in a compromising position despite the cap room that they had. So the Bears weren't able to make that trade. Instead, they send them off to Buffalo and they get a second round pick in return. And of course, Buffalo has significant need at receiver. You have Josh Allen, who probably, you know, top two or three in terms of arm talent in the NFL, right? You can make the argument that he is the most talented thrower of the football in the NFL. And for whatever reason, it just hasn't worked out in terms of the receivers that they've had. Of course, Curtis Samuel is no longer there, but they brought in Josh Palmer, I think, a season ago. They drafted Keon Coleman early. Those guys haven't necessarily been able to contribute on a consistent basis. I'm not sure what happened with Keon Coleman. I was never a big fan. I'll put it out there, Florida State Seminoles. Anyway, I don't have my resident Seminole fan here to give a hard time about that, but certainly their inability to push the football down the field really compromised this offense. And more certainly, even as he gets a little bit older, he's capable. He's demonstrated the ability to stretch the field. It's not a perfect situation by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's definitely a move in the right direction. I still think they should address that position group in the draft, whether it be first or third round. The Bradley Chubb deal, of course, coming off an injury, but I think just the length and the compensation works really well for Buffalo. Buffalo is going through a transition in terms of changing their defense. So Sean McDermott, again, it just keeps on happening. Another team that has a new coach, right? Sean McDermott, of course, a defensive-minded coach. He runs a 43 defense, four down linemen. New staff here under Joe Brady, they're going to run a 34. Okay, so that means you need different personnel. And that led to the trade of Teron Johnson, who had been an excellent nickel. You're going to see just four defensive backs, that base defense a lot more frequently here in Buffalo. Of course, Teron Johnson was traded to the Raiders. That was a good move by the Raiders. So Bradley Chubb has the ability to put his hand in the ground as an edge rusher or stand up in the 34 defense. So nice addition there. D offered to help bolster that secondary along with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. And it's a one-year deal, but it's a good deal because Gardner-Johnson is a quality player. He's cheaper alternative than Teron Johnson as well. Other than that, no significant moves. They did re-up with Connor McGovern, Dawson Knox. They love a Dawson Knox. He and Dalton Kincaid form a good battery there at the tight end position. But the Chubb, Alford, and Moore trade obviously are going to loom big for the Buffalo Bills moving forward. Again, as I go back and think about what they're going to do in the draft, how they should approach the draft, I still think they need to address the receiving room. I don't know what's going to happen with Keon Coleman. Again, the brain trusts, the decision makers ultimately who made that selection have either they're no longer in the building or they've kind of backed off of that. I don't think DJ Moore alone is going to be enough to get Buffalo's passing game all the way back on track. I think you certainly need to do a better job of getting Khalil Shakir the football beyond the line of scrimmage. So there's some things that they still need to work on, but a decent start here in Buffalo. Okay, so we go to the Carolina Panthers, and this is actually the first team I think that has no changes among their head coach. And I think the Panthers, obviously coming off a trip to the playoffs, right? They edged out the Buccaneers in the last week of the season, gave the Rams a run for their money. I like what they've done in free agency. I think they've done a very good job. Of course, right at the top, you have Jalen Phillips, and Of course, Phillips was traded by the Dolphins in season to Philadelphia to really give them some more teeth in terms of their pass rush. Philadelphia, this time last year, lost a lot of talent, right? They were coming off a Super Bowl, and a lot of guys went to go get paid elsewhere. Phillips came in and really helped stabilize that pass rush. It may not have all ended in sacks, but certainly providing consistent pressure on the opposing quarterback. That's exactly what Carolina needed. They needed more teeth in terms of their pass rush. They got a couple of young players in Nick Scorton and Princely. Uh, his last name, the pronunciation is escaping me, but Princely and Scorton are intriguing prospects. I think Scorton's going to be a good one, but they're young. They haven't necessarily proven themselves. You bring in Jalen Phillips to really be the guy, right? He's demonstrated that he can win his one-on-ones, and you got a slide protection his way. That'll make the other young edge rushers better. Devin Lloyd had a big season in Jacksonville. Ultimately, got paid. I think that's a fairly decent contract on behalf of the Panthers. I thought Lloyd probably would be averaging closer to 20 million, but at $15 million a season, I think they actually get a bargain. Again, that's another position where they needed to bolster that off-ball linebacker. Now, the thing about Lloyd is, and this is the reason why I really like this deal, is that Lloyd actually excels as a pass rusher. At least historically, he has. And that is what the Panthers needed the most. Considering how well they played defensively a season ago, they didn't necessarily impact the quarterback very much. And I don't know that you can sustain that season after season, right? So they made it a point here. They invested heavily in terms of some front seven defenders. Just today, if I'm not mistaken, as of today, they signed a 1-year deal with Rasheed Walker. And I have to tell you, I thought Rasheed Walker was going to have a much more robust market in free agency, right? This is a former 7th-round pick of the Green Bay Packers that has outperformed his draft billing, right? So I thought he was going to cash in. Apparently, the market just didn't see it that way. NFL teams didn't see it that way. You got the incumbent Ike Ekwonu having had a serious knee injury, I believe, in the playoff game, right? So he likely won't be ready for the start of the season. You have a gaping hole there at the left side on the blind side up there for Bryce Young. To get Rasheed Walker on a 1-year, $10 million deal is a bargain, all things considered. I think this is one of the better moves. It's not going to grab the headlines like Jalen Phillips or Devin Lloyd will, but as far as stabilizing things up front, again, I mention it all the time, and I'm going to continue to reemphasize it. The offensive line is the most important position group. To get Walker a proven commodity to stabilize things until Ekwonu gets healthy was a big win for the Panthers. Very big win. There's some other names here, certainly worth mentioning, but I can't get past the fact that they were able to get Walker given their need, right? There was no desperation here. They just kind of waited things out. First wave kind of pass, and then, of course, Walker sitting there for, like I said, a relatively cost-effective deal. So impressed by what the Panthers have done thus far. Among the teams we've looked at thus far, I think Carolina's done the best job here in free agency to this point. Okay, I alluded to the Chicago Bears earlier. The Bears, of course, I'm sure their fans are a little bummed that you didn't get Maxx Crosby. I think, we're talking perhaps conference championship and Maxx Crosby there, right? Opposite Montez Sweat. They definitely didn't improve their interior pass rush, but certainly having those two guys who can obviously win their one-on-ones, and of course, teams go out of their way to game plan for Maxx Crosby. So having missed out on that, at least to this point, it hurts. It hurts a bit for sure. But they did address the middle of their defense, and that to me was the biggest concern heading into the draft. On top of the left tackle, so not unlike the Panthers and Ike Ekwonu, Ozzie Trapilo, he had an injury in the playoffs, right? And he had stepped in for Braxton Jones and was starting to play some pretty good football. Ultimately, was going to be your left tackle moving forward, in his rookie year. He gets injured late in the season, so now you got a concern. When we come back and we're lining it up, who's going to be our starting left tackle? They re-up with Braxton Jones. Yes, once again, smart move. And then they also added Jedrick Willis, who's had his share of injuries, but he's a talented player. He just hasn't necessarily been able to stay healthy there in Cleveland. So, as I mentioned, they prioritize the middle of their defense. It's going straight through the middle, front to back. Neville Gallimore in the middle. I think Gallimore, generally speaking, has been more of a run stopper, at least as memory serves. Hoping to get a little bit more pass rush out of the interior defense. I think they could still address that group. There's a decent class of interior defensive linemen in this particular draft class. So I would imagine on one of the first 2 days of the draft, they'll address defensive tackle Devin Bush coming off a really strong season there with the Browns. Of course, they let Tremaine Edmonds walk, and I think that's a good move. Tremaine Edmonds was not playing up to the level of his contract, what he was costing against the cap. He's now in New York, and New York had a desperate need at the second level of their defense. But Bush Bush gives you a lot more in terms of pass coverage, right? Whereas I thought Edmonds was a bit of a liability. You know what I mean? So you bring in Bush on a less expensive deal, and like I said, he was playing some good football last year. And then Kobe Bryant, right? He was manning the back end of that Seattle Seahawks defense, that vaunted Seahawks defense. I don't know that the Bears actually had a safety under contract entering the new league year. So getting Kobe Bryant certainly made a lot of sense. Those three positions, interior defensive line, off ball linebacker, and safety, were all areas that I thought were at the top of the list in terms of draft needs, assuming you could get that offensive tackle, that left tackle position situated. So this is another strong showing, I think. If they if by chance they're able to work out a deal with Crosby, I don't know that the Raiders are still motivated to move him, but certainly if the Bears are willing to meet, or perhaps the Raiders are willing to reduce their asking price for Crosby, I think the Bears should jump on that. They are right on the cusp, right on the cusp. They traded for Garrett Bradbury as well. So in terms of rounding out that offensive line, their incumbent center decided to retire. I think he's dealing with some I want to say psychological challenges. So he decided to retire. Garrett Bradbury's solid. He's solid. He'll help, mitigate that loss. And then I can't stress enough the addition, bringing Braxton Jones, another player that I thought would have a fairly decent market, bringing him back on a very team friendly deal makes a lot of sense when your incumbent left tackle is dealing with injury. He's still trying to recover. Last mention I'll make is Khalif Raymond. So obviously, head coach Ben Johnson was the offensive coordinator in Detroit. He's familiar with Raymond. He can bolster your special teams and then also give you a little something to passing him. I mentioned they traded away DJ Moore. Burden and Adunze will be your top receivers. Of course, you have Colson Loveland at tight end, but certainly Raymond, he offers a different skill set. He's explosive. He makes plays after the catch. Nice little wrinkle to the offense. Won't be used heavily, but certainly he can win you a game or two with his game breaking speed. All right, keep it going here in terms of the free agency fallout. Got the Cincinnati Bengals, and you don't see a ton of moves here, but I think they are astute moves. Defensively, the Bengals were bad, and that's putting it mildly. Historically bad, right? They just yardage by by the tons. They went to work. They went to work. Not a ton of names, but I thought they spent good money in the form of Boye Mafe. Again, part of that pass rush rotation there in Seattle. I don't think Mafe is necessarily a game changer, but he's going to stabilize things. He knows what it looks like. He knows what a winner looks like, and he's going to stabilize things. He should get you in that 6 to 8 range in terms of sacks. Brian Cook is coming from Kansas City, so he's well coached, physical. They need that. They need guys who can tackle. They need guys who can get guys on the ground and who are going to be assignment sound. And then Jonathan Allen was a cap casualty there in Minnesota, and perhaps past his prime, but the interior of that defensive line needed a facelift. They needed a facelift. Jonathan Allen could help, certainly. I think you want to manage his snaps, obviously. But I think just having him in there, helping some young guys develop, giving you a good 25 to 30 snaps every Sunday could go a long way in terms of improving the Bengals defense. The reality is that the Bengals defense only has one way to go, and that's up. But I do like these additions. That should not deter them from going very heavy on the defensive side of the ball in the draft. This is a defensive laden 2026 NFL draft class. So I expect them to really pour their resources into continuing to bolster in the defense. And then, of course, they retain Dalton Reisner, right? They've had an issue since Joe Burrow has been under center. And that's going to be really the focal point as far as the offense is concerned, just keeping Burrow healthy. I think if you keep Burrow healthy, you're always going to have a chance. If you could play some decent league average defense, you're going to make the playoffs with Joe Burrow under center. So Dalton Reisner certainly helps to that end. The Browns needed about, I want to say, as much as 80% of their offensive line was being turned over. So you need as many as four starters on your offensive line, at least three, but as many as four. They went to work. And I have to applaud the Browns, right? New brain trust there. Zion Johnson, a player that I've always liked, perhaps has underachieved a bit in Los Angeles. Part of the reason why he's moving, I think there's a scheme change there that may not necessarily fit him, but hopefully he can kind of stabilize and find his footing because I always thought he was a good prospect coming in. Elgington Jenkins was a cap casualty in Green Bay. He's dealt with some injuries, but he just provides so much flexibility, and I think he'll be a good center. They got him on a relatively inexpensive deal. Quincy Williams to help replace what's his name, Devin Bush at the second level of the defense, and then a trade of Titus Howard. Mind you, Howard has had his ups and downs. He's absolutely had his ups and downs in Houston, but when you enter an offseason and you have to replace 80% of your offensive line, trading for a Titus Howard, bringing in Johnson and Jenkins, I think that's a very, very strong step in the right direction. You know what I mean? I think now they can afford to go, skill position early. They have two first round selections in the 2026 class. A fairly decent collection of selections, right? They have at least, I want to say, as many as three top 40 picks, perhaps even four. So they're going to have an opportunity to add pass catchers, add playmakers, but also round out this offensive line. So I like what they've done thus far via free agency. That takes us to the Dallas Cowboys. And of course, Dallas did what they typically do, right? They were part of a couple of trades. You have Rashawn Gary. The Packers perhaps may have pulled a fast one on Dallas. It seemingly was reported that Gary was going to be released. Gary himself indicated on his Instagram that he wanted to thank the Green Bay fans for the time, moving on to the next chapter, and then he deleted it and claims he was hacked. I think the Packers were trying to obviously communicate with Gary, saying, "Hey, listen, we're either going to trade you or release you." The Cowboys didn't want to compete with anyone on the open market, so they ultimately traded for Rashawn Gary, gave up a fourth round pick in the 2027 class, and for a team starved of pass rush, rumored to have been very heavy on the Maxx Crosby sweepstakes. I thought perhaps Trey Hendrickson was the fallback plan, but they did not like the price tag. All of that is a byproduct of the Joneses' thought process when it comes to free agency. And I'll be honest with you, it hasn't served them well. It hasn't served them well. Of course, they traded Odigizua as well. They had, I think, as many as three defensive tackles making over $20 million a year. So they had to make a change there. They worked out a deal with San Francisco, who had a need in terms of a three technique, a guy that penetrates, gets upfield. But Dallas typically does not reward players via free agency. What they do is they'll bring in a Kobe Durant, as you see there, Obaniah, as you see there, on these 1 year deals, these kind of prove it deals. And then if those players play to the level they're expected to play to or exceed it, then Dallas will engage them for a long-term deal. That's how they typically treat free agency. And I think it's I think it's shrewd in certain circumstances, but when you operate like that 90, 95% of the time, you don't take advantage of the fact that Dak Prescott was playing great football a season ago, right? You just couldn't stop anybody. You just couldn't score enough points. You had to when it came to wins and losses, you were outscoring your opponent. So and of course that's the way games are decided. But ultimately, you couldn't get stops when you needed it. So I think Dallas is saying, listen, we got two first round selections. They've added a an additional day two pick in terms of that Odigizua trade. They're thinking to themselves, hey, it's a defensive rich class. Let's just address a couple of areas, fill a couple gaps so we can go best player available on the defensive side of the ball. Which again, I don't hate, but my reluctance to really give Dallas a lot of credit. Of course, Jalen Thompson, they did do a long-term deal with, and I think that's a pretty shrewd move there, former Arizona Cardinal. I think you at times just have to push your chips to the middle of the table. And I talked about this a lot over the years when referring to the Green Bay Packers. The Packers, by all means, draft and develop. Draft and develop, you retain those guys, you extend those guys. Great. But when you have a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers, when he was in his prime, right? Every year you should be competing for a championship. To come up short year after year after year, they have the one Super Bowl appearance win to show for it, but to be ousted in the divisional round of the conference championship, divisional round, conference championship, and not just say, okay, we're going to push our chips in the middle of the table and we're going to make a run for it, right? We're going to go big on a free agent or two to put us over the top because we got Aaron Rodgers. We're going to be in every game. We're going to have an opportunity to win every week, every Sunday. And to not make that move, I think they wasted some of the best years of Rodgers' career. And I think that's what's happening in Dallas as well. Dallas has a lot more work to do in terms of their defense. I think they recognize that, which is why I don't hate the way they're approaching it now. But they've had some teams over the years that they just went cheap. They just operated very cheaply in free agency and didn't want to commit those big guaranteed dollars to kind of get the team over the hump. And part of the reason why they haven't had the postseason success that they would have hoped for. The Broncos are up next, and as you can see here, no free agent signing. I'm not sure if that's accurate. Nothing comes to mind. They focus on retaining their own players, right? They really have. I will say, Dre Greenlaw, the starting linebacker, he is now back in San Francisco. That's where he started his career. That makes a lot of sense. They re-up with Singleton, Trotman. They definitely need to improve the second level of their defense as well as that tight end position. I thought the J.K. Dobbins signing was interesting. Dobbins has dealt with a lot of injuries throughout his career. He was playing decently, but he clearly isn't as explosive as he once was. You can see that the injuries have taken a toll. The fact that they re-upped surprised me a little bit. That actually surprised me a little bit. But again, I think that goes to show that teams are not very excited about this running back class, this rookie incoming class. Of course, you got Jeremiah Love, who is, a special player. And I think you got a couple other players that I would consider in day two: Jonah Coleman, Jadarian Price, Love's teammate, and then perhaps Mike Washington of Arkansas. But there just isn't a lot of excitement about this running back group. So I think that had led to part of the reason why they re-up with Dobbins after dealing with another injury. So again, Broncos just focus on retaining their own talent. They were just one game away from a Super Bowl appearance. Of course, they didn't have their starting quarterback. So I think they just feel like we just need to run it back. Okay. Takes us to the Detroit Lions. And of course, Detroit is going through a bit of a transition. I think obviously the goal is to elongate their championship window. They missed the playoffs after, I want to say, 3 straight years, making to the playoffs, really turning that franchise around. But injuries really have wreaked havoc on this Lions team. And the strength of this Lions team, when they are playing at their best, they're able to play with the lead, allow Aiden Hutchinson and company to get after the quarterback, play opportunistic defense, but really control things up front with the line of scrimmage. And that's where everything starts as far as their running game, play action with Jared Goff, getting the receivers, hitting them in stride. It all starts up front. And their offensive line did not play at the level he had grown accustomed to. Of course, Taylor Decker was mulling retirement because he's dealt with a lot of injuries. He actually stated that he wanted to come back, and the Lions decided to move on. They trade for Juice Scruggs from the Texans to kind of help bolster the interior of that offensive line. You could see their biggest signing was Cade Mays, again, trying to bolster the interior of that offensive line. They have a question mark at tackle. I see Larry Borum there, but I don't know that he's a starter. I think he's more of a swing tackle in case he got an injury. They're going to the thought process, at least, is that they're going to address offensive tackle in the draft. I think they also, and I don't see it here, they need to address pass rusher opposite Aiden Hutchinson. They absolutely need to get that figured out. If they can get that figured out, they'll be in really good shape. But you only have one first-round pick. Good news is that there is a lot of depth in terms of the edge rusher. I think they'll be able to find a good player on day two to help Aiden Hutchinson out on the defensive side of the ball. But clearly, the emphasis is the offensive line, and it makes a ton of sense. That is where everything is started. The Packers have had an eventful offseason, and it's come in the form of actual, several trades. Of course, I mentioned they traded away Rashawn Gary, got some draft compensation back in 2027. They traded for Zaire Franklin, Quay Walker, their starting middle linebacker. He was unrestricted free agent, got paid. They as part of that trade, they traded, I believe, Kobe Wooden So they needed to address the defensive line. They bring in Javon Hargrave from the rival Vikings. Um, their secondary, really some significant question marks in terms of the boundary corner. Benjamin St. Juice, he has the size. He has the requisite size that you're looking for on the boundary. And then, of course, retained a lot of players. I mentioned Elgin Jenkins left as well. They bring back Sean Ryan. He's listed as a tackle, but he's a guard. Brooks Kennard can be a swing tackle. Brenton Cox, Dick Neiman, bringing back a lot of their own players. So it'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see. I know they have some young players in the wings. I mentioned Rasheed Walker and the move that the Panthers made. He was their starting left tackle. He's now moved on. They already have Jordan Morgan, a former first round player, who's expected to slot in there. They say they think he's ready to go now. Belton from a season ago, good player. They moved him from tackle into guard. I think they just need a little depth along the offensive line, but they seemingly feel good about their starting five. So we'll see how that works out. I think Green Bay has more work to do, though. If they want to get back, if they want to keep pace with the Bears, they got more work to do for sure. Houston Texans, as I mentioned, a couple of players. Titus Howard was part of a trade. Drew Scruggs was part of a trade. These are former offensive linemen, starting offensive line for the Texans. Of course, their offensive line was much maligned last season, and of course, in that Drew Scruggs trade, they acquired David Montgomery, who is a major upgrade to Joe Mixon. So Woody Marks and Montgomery, I think, will form a pretty good duo. The Texans are reshaping their offensive line, right? They signed Braden Smith, who by trade as a tackle. I think they're going to have him play guard. They re-upped with Ed Ingram. You can see there 3 years, 37.5 million. And then brought in Trent Brown, or re-upped with Trent Brown on a 1 year deal. Trent Brown has a long-standing history in the NFL, huge offensive tackle. So they're trying to do things a little bit, shake things up a little bit along their offensive line. I think they're still missing a piece. Their biggest deal was really in terms of retaining Danielle Hunter, who's one of the better edge rushers in the league, a 1 year extension for $40 million. Right. So you tack on the $40 million to his existing contract and give him a $30 million, $31 million signing bonus. Reed Blankenship, I thought was interesting. Texans have a remarkable defense. A couple areas that they needed to address. Interior defensive line, they did so in the form of re-upping with Sheldon Rankins and bringing in Logan Hall. But safety, opposite Kalen Bullock. So Kalen Bullock is your prototypical free safety. He's going to play at the top of the roof. He's best in coverage, right? You got great corners. You got a great nickel back there in Jalen Petrie. You're just missing that other safety. And I think what they're asking of Reed Blankenship in terms of being a strong safety, playing with physicality, helping out in the run predominantly is exactly what he does best. So solid signing, about $8 million a year. I think that's actually a pretty solid signing for the Texans. Okay. The Colts, of course, they send Franklin to Green Bay for Wooden, and you can see they made a concerted effort along the defensive line here. Michael Clemens, Derek Nandi, trying to beef things up. Added Arden Key. I think you want Arden Key playing opposite Latu. Really want to be able to do a better job of controlling the line of scrimmage, getting after the passer. The big moves were effectively retaining Alec Pierce and Daniel Jones. Now, I have I didn't mention there was another trade. They traded Michael Pittman, who had been their top receiver for several years, over to Pittsburgh. So they added some draft capital there. But they clearly believe in Alec Pierce. And Alec Pierce was going to get paid. There was no question about it. He was going to get paid. 1,000-yard season a year ago on very sparse target share, right? He didn't get a lot of opportunities, but he made the most of them. It remains to be seen, though, whether as the guy, right, as the focal point on the perimeter, whether or not he's going to be able to live up to it. He said he's up for the challenge. We'll see. He's a phenomenal athlete, good size, good speed. He can clearly make plays in the deep parts of the field, but it almost seems as if Pierce has been treated like a one-trick pony. His belief is that he's a complete receiver. So we'll see what that looks like ultimately. But if that doesn't work out, that's going to sting. That's definitely going to sting. That's a significant chunk of change there for a guy who really only has 1 year of significant production. Daniel Jones, obviously the Colts were rocking and rolling at the beginning of the year. Jones, they stumbled a little bit there, and then Jones goes down with an injury. There's a belief here. The Anthony Richardson era is obviously done. There's certainly a belief that Daniel Jones is the long-term answer, is the panacea there in Indianapolis. So 2 years, $88 million. It's about $30 to $40 million is the going rate for league average quarterbacks. And Jones was definitely playing at a higher level than we've seen in recent years from him. We'll see, coming back from injury, whether or not he actually can earn up to $100 million, so $50 million a year effectively. Okay. Next up, we got my boy Raj, Jacksonville Jaguars. They bring in Chris Rodriguez. Of course, they lose Travis Etienne. Mind you, the pronunciation, I'll have to learn it. He has a different pronunciation of his last last name. He's going back home to the state of Louisiana, he's joining the Saints. But Rodriguez played fairly well for the Commanders a season ago. You have Bashal Tutin that I think this organization is very high on. You pair them together. Monteric Brown is the deal that really stands out, right? Former seventh round pick, really outplayed his draft slot and earned a significant payday. So really excited for Monteric Brown and what he does to kind of keep, an improving, a young and improving secondary intact. Of course, you get Travis Hunter back from injuries and we put playing corner predominantly, which I've always maintained that's the way you want to use Travis Hunter, right? It's much more difficult to find competent cornerback play, and his upside is huge there, right? He hasn't even tapped into the technique. It's been a really the emphasis has been on athleticism and ball skills, and of course, you can't teach the ball skills. You can still use him moonlight on offense, certainly in the red zone with his body control and those aforementioned ball skills, but definitely want him leaning into playing corner. Okay, so the Kansas City Chiefs are coming off their worst year effectively under Andy Reid and of course with Patrick Mahomes under center. I think they clearly wanted to make their running game a priority, effectively the worst in the NFL. And Kenneth Walker, Super Bowl MVP, certainly gives you that big play capability. Pacheco hasn't been the same after the injury. I'll be frank. I have not always been a huge Pacheco fan. Runs hard, but not great vision. You know what I'm saying? So he's always been a little limited, but Walker is a significant improvement, and I even thought that the Chiefs should, considering that I don't expect them to be picking as high as they are in the 2026 NFL draft moving forward. They have the ninth overall pick. I thought perhaps, at a certain point, Jeremiah Love gets past the Giants at 5. You might want to get aggressive. You might want to put a call in with the Cleveland Browns at 6, get in front of the Commanders and the Saints. But I think that's off the table here, definitely with Kenneth Walker being added. Top running back in free agency between he and Travis Etienne. They added Lloyd Gilman. They lost Cook, brought in Gilman. Pass rush. Expect them to either address the pass rush or corner. Of course, Trent McDuffie, they traded him away, got some significant draft capital. They have a second first round pick now. But they also lost Jalen Watson to the Rams. So the Rams came away with both of the Chiefs starting corners. I do like Noah Williams a lot. I think he's going to move into that starting lineup. You probably just need another corner. I saw also recently L'Jarius Sneed was released. I wouldn't be surprised if he returns in Kansas City on a team-friendly deal. That wouldn't shock me at all. And then, of course, Travis Kelce's coming back another year. Certainly not the player he once was, but a familiar weapon there for Mahomes. That takes us to the Las Vegas Raiders, and very impressed by what they're doing here in Los Angeles. Of course, the Crosby trade fell through, but you can see the vision here. The offensive line was a huge issue season ago. Geno Smith struggled mightily. Of course, they used the first round pick, a top 6 or 7 pick on Ashton Genty, and they just couldn't get him to the second level. They just couldn't block it up. So you bring in Tyler Linderbaum, one of the better offensive linemen, the top center in free agency. I think they're going to go back to the offensive line. Or they should go back to the offensive line in the draft. Not the first round, obviously, because of course that's the Mendoza selection. But as the draft proceeds, I think they should go back to the offensive line. But bringing in Linderbaum helps everybody, right? Gets you in the right protection. You got a upper echelon center to help out your young rookie quarterback. Quay Walker, and Nakobe Dean. They're going through a bit of a change in terms of the offensive front. I believe we're going 4-3 to 3-4. So really addressing the second level of that defense, which has been an eyesore for the Raiders and the Raiders fans for an extended period of time. I like the Jalen Naylor pickup. I think he demonstrated that he's a quality tertiary receiving option. Now you got Brock Bowers, obviously. And you got a couple young players on the perimeter. I still think they need a guy. I still think they need a go-to guy on the perimeter. But I like the direction we're going in as far as the weaponry. And then of course today they signed Connor Hayward, fullback, and most teams don't actually leverage a fullback, but this offense, this Kubiak offense does. And I think Ashton Genty is going to be in for a big season, big bounce back here in his sophomore year. Eric Stokes, re-upping with him, Malcolm Kuntz. I think those are all really good moves. Stokes played very well, especially one of the few bright spots. And I mentioned earlier, the addition of Teron Johnson shouldn't be understated, right? That nickel position is indispensable at the NFL level with the proliferation of 11 personnel, three receiver sets. You really need that nickel to kind of serve as your third linebacker, your fifth defensive back, and play that slot. You got two-way goals. It is a demanding position. I know they teams tend to just like force their smaller defensive backs into the nickel. That doesn't always bowl well. Now there's some smaller defensive backs that do a great job at it, and I would pay my nickel handsomely because they have a lot of responsibility. So Teron Johnson is a very good ad considering the fact that he was made available by the Bills. The Chargers are going through a little bit of a transition in terms of their offense. So they bring in former Dolphins head coach Mike McDaniel, and Mike McDaniel. One thing for sure, and I think this certainly resonates with Jim Harbaugh, is that they're going to run the football, and then they're creative with it. They're going to do that wide zone. They're going to get guys on the perimeter. Of course, they used the first round pick on Amari and Hampton last year. The signing of Keaton Mitchell, I think, in this particular scheme is dangerous. Mitchell is explosive, incredibly explosive. The acceleration is terrific. Speed is terrific. When given his opportunity, of course, you're not going to get a lot of opportunity behind Derrick Henry, but certainly when given his opportunity, he's been really good. He's been explosive. So they bring in Tyler Biotish, Cole Strange to better fit this system, this wide zone system, get to the second level, get to those cutoff blocks. And of course, you can see there bringing in that fullback again. So there's clearly a plan here. So I like what the Chargers did with the free agents that they brought in, and then in terms of the players that they retained, Tierra Tart, Trey Pipkins to kind of serve as a swing offensive lineman, re-upping with Khalil Mack. Of course, Odafe always now with the Commanders. We'll mention him a bit later, but Mack longer in the tooth, but you put him on a pitch count, he can still be very effective. Of course, you got Thule. He's the main pass rusher now, but I think that's an area that they need to address relatively early in the draft as well. Relatively early. Denzel Perriman, another um, wily veteran, is back at the second level of the defense. I think there's an appreciation for that veteran leadership and know-how, right? As you transition and play those young guys more and more, help them develop, get up to speed as quickly as possible. So Chargers have done a solid job, right? Especially as they're again changing their scheme in terms of their running game. Okay, the Rams, and I alluded to it. The Rams made the big trade. They reset the cornerback market with Trent McDuffie. Now, McDuffie was not coming off his best season. McDuffie is an All Pro under his belt, and certainly 2 seasons ago looked like one of the on a short list for best corners in the league 2 3 years ago. Last year, he had some struggles. He had some struggles last year, but I think that's more of a byproduct of the fact that the Chiefs just didn't have a consistent pass rush, right? No defensive back is able to cover for forever. The Rams have no question marks in terms of the pass rush. Really the question mark for me at this point is that how are you going to retain everybody, right? You reset the market with McDuffie, fairly significant contract with his teammate in Kansas City, bring him over in Jalen Watson. So clearly there's a certain style of defensive back that you're looking for. And you address the cornerback position, which is a glaring need. But certainly this year, I think they're ready to make a run. They're making it ready, and they're still trying to make it happen. They were thought to be in the Maxx Crosby sweepstakes. There's been conversations, rumors about them being involved on AJ Brown, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but certainly there's been at least rumors along those lines. You got Kobe Turner, you got Byron Young, you got Steve Avila, you got Warren McClendon, who really stepped up last year. You got Puka Nakua. You got a lot of players who are going to be looking for extensions this year and next year. And I know you'll get some cap relief in the form of maybe Poona Ford and perhaps Devontae Adams in 2027, but I just don't know it's going to be enough to go around. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. They re up with Cam Curl as well, and then Tyler Higbee. So for those of you with Terrence Ferguson stocks in fantasy, I certainly have mine. Not thrilled about that. I'm not thrilled about that, but Cam Curl certainly earned his money. The Dolphins. So again, clearly the Dolphins going through significant change. They pulled the band-aid off. They just ripped it off with Tua. They're not spreading that dead cap over multiple years. They just decided, you know what, we're gonna suck it up. So they made it a move to acquire Malik Willis, who obviously acquitted himself in his opportunities there in Green Bay. The coaching staff clearly familiar with him. They bring him in. He's a starter. He's a starter out the gate. So Malik Willis will have an opportunity to earn even more money if he acquits himself well. Although the Dolphins have a lot of work to do. Lots of one-year deals, as you can see, in both free agents signed and those that they retain, their own free agents, because again, you lost effectively $100 million worth of cap. So you're gonna have to, you know, you're gonna have to shop for the bargains for sure. Minnesota, the big deal here clearly is Kyler Murray, right? Murray's another quarterback owed a lot of money. The Cardinals decided, you know what, we're just gonna deal with it. Of course, if they had moved off of Murray next year, it would have been a much softer blow in the form of dead cap. But this new coaching staff, you don't have any time to waste. Frankly, coaches get fired after 1 year, 1 or 2 years. You don't really have any time to waste, so they move on quickly. They move on quickly, and like I said, Brissett, they're in a position where they didn't have to necessarily spend money. The Cardinals, that is, on the starter, assuming they move forward with Brissett. But the Vikings, unfortunately, they moved off of Sam Darnold, who had a career year a season ago. He goes to Seattle, and he's a big part of the reason in terms of them winning a championship. And Vikings fans and that coaching staff are kind of like, oh, so we bet on the young player, our former first round pick, and JJ McCarthy. It was just a couple of years in, but he didn't look good when he was healthy, and he struggled to stay healthy the last couple of seasons. So we're not handing it to him. We're not handing it to him. I had wondered where Kyler Murray would land. He was always heavily linked to the Vikings, and that's ultimately where he ends up. And so to give every opportunity, I'm sure he's going to be given every opportunity to win the starting job. Probably expected to be the starter. James Pierre, they brought in as well. Cornerback definitely a need. And then, of course, they focused on re-signing the guys. This was a team that had some cap constraints. Move off of Hargrave, move off of Allen. I think they want to bring back their safety, the guy that's been there forever. His name's escaping me, Harrison Smith. There you go. They want to bring him back, but they want to bring him back on a more cap-friendly, team-friendly deal. Um, we'll see. We'll see how it works. The last time we saw Kyler Murray, it didn't look good. It didn't look good. So we'll see. We'll see if he bounces back. Okay, we got the New England Patriots up next, and of course, the Patriots they wanted to go big at receiver, and the guy that they wanted was AJ Brown, and apparently, the asking price is a bit too steep. A little bit of a game of chicken there with the Philadelphia Eagles. Alec Pierce re-ups with the Colts. I think this Romeo Dobbs deal is actually a better deal than the Pierce deal. Not just because of the cap figure, but because of how Dobbs has a little bit more of a history of performing than Pierce as well. Elijah Vera Tucker has dealt with injuries, but he's a very good player. They need to improve their offensive line. If he can stay healthy, that's a home run at that price point. Draymond Jones is really going to help bolster your pass rush. You really didn't have much outside of Harold Landry and Milton Williams, so Draymond Jones helps there. Kevin Byard on the back end. Some nice, shrewd deals here, but of course, the big one here, especially after you decide to move off of Stephon Diggs. Stephon Diggs was owed a ton of money. They decided, you know what, we can make better use of this cap space, get more players. Um, if Dobbs is the consolation price, I think it's a solid one, albeit I think they definitely would prefer to have AJ Brown. The New Orleans Saints and the New York Giants, Travis Etienne, man. Actually, I believe it's pronounced Hn. Hn. Travis Etienne is his name. Lands a big deal, and deservedly so. I think the Saints certainly had a fairly significant need in terms of the running back position. This is one of those teams that I think certainly, if they thought Jeremiah Love was going to be available at 7 or 8, I should say, eighth overall, they would have gone in that direction. They have the offensive line already outfitted, particularly with the addition of David Edwards. They're good to go now. Um, that would have been a good landing spot, but I don't think I think they're fairly certain that Love won't be available. So they made the decision to pay A10, and I think he's going to have a lot of success on that fast track in that dome. I think he's going to have a lot of success. Obviously, you need a player to kind of pair with him, but nice addition there. They're bringing Caden Ellis to help soften the blow of the loss of their longtime leader, Demario Davis. And then Noah Fant. Noah Fant has been around for a while, but solid add to your tight end room. Mentioned the Giants and Isaiah Likely. That's really the crown jewel of this free agent class. Tremaine Edmonds, this is a huge need at linebacker. Now, Edmonds, again, hasn't been playing great football, but it hasn't exactly been poor either. And that's really what you were getting from the Giants linebacker, poor play. So I think if Edmonds can maintain kind of a league average level of play, they'll definitely be improved there. Greg Newsome is a shrewd addition. They have some significant needs at the cornerback position. Um, not a ton of moves here, but I think, and this is really a common thread with most of these teams. I think a lot of teams did a good job addressing glaring needs, and they put themselves in position to draft best player available in the draft, and that's the position you want to be in. You want to be able to select the best player available on your board, and of course, boards change. You know, they differ from team to team, but you want to avoid as much as possible having to draft for need because you don't know, those are unknown quantities, right? You're going from the collegiate level to the NFL level. You just don't know who's ultimately going to pan out. It's still a guessing game. I think I mentioned, likely being the most significant. I'm gonna take that back. I think Jermaine Illuminor re-signing him is the most significant, right? The Giants for a long time struggled to field a quality offensive line. That right tackle position had been the bane of their existence for years. But when they brought in Illuminor a couple seasons ago, he really stabilized things. Re-upping with him makes a ton of sense. And again, a very, very cap friendly number. I'm surprised he didn't have a more robust market, and he decided to go back to North. Perhaps he just wanted to be there. So, really, really strong signing. They brought back a lot of their own players. The Jets were busy, traded for Geno Smith, so they clearly decided, okay, we can't rule out Justin Fields. We're not going back down that route. We're not going to use a second overall pick on Ty Simpson. Let's bring in Geno Smith. This is where it all started for Geno. Geno was originally drafted, I think, in 2009. Was it 2009? No, it can't be that long ago. Can't be that long ago. Um, that would be 17 years. Not that long ago, but maybe 2012, 2013. I forget exactly when, but Geno Smith started his career in New York as a Jet. Didn't work out, found success in Seattle, went over to Las Vegas. That didn't necessarily work. They had some real significant issues along the offensive line. I think it's a better situation in New York this season as compared to the Raiders last season. I do expect the Raiders to make a significant step here, but certainly better situation for Geno as compared to last year. They also traded for Minka Fitzpatrick. The Dolphins were looking for some cap relief. The Jets need some playmakers on the back end of their defense. I also read today they re-upped with Andre Cisco, but this is a team that didn't have any INTs. They traded away Sauce Gardner. So corner is probably an area that you can anticipate them to address early. I think they have 4 top 44 picks. I think they have 2, 16, 33, and 44, if I'm not mistaken. So they're going to be busy early in this draft. I'm going to be able to really um, get some, I think, instant impact players via the draft with those first 4 selections. But they didn't rest on their laurels. They continue to address areas of need. Joseph Osai, I mentioned Demario Davis. I think bringing him in is going to be huge, right? Davis is like 36, 37, but he's still playing at a high level, and he's a leader. He's a leader of men. Dylan Parham to help mitigate the loss of Elijah Vera Tucker. Onyemata has been a good player for many years in the league. In Gabare to round out this pass rush. I think they're going through a bit of a transition in terms of the defensive scheme. So trying to get the right players in there. Dane Belton, Nashawn Wright. Again, adding players via free agency, proven NFL film to work off of to address needs, and then put yourself in a more advantageous position come the NFL draft where they have a lot of picks. They also acquired Devondre Sweat. They traded away Jermaine Johnson, who was going to go into the final year of his deal coming off an injury, and added Devondre Sweat to be the nose in their 3-4 odd man front. Philadelphia. Okay, so not it wasn't for trying, and I know they've been some conversation around AJ Brown and Jalen Carter, but those two very talented players remain on the roster. They were certainly looking for another boundary corner. You got Quinion Mitchell, of course. You got Cooper DeJean in the slot, but they needed someone opposite Quinion Mitchell. And Reek Willen somewhat fell out of favor in Seattle, but has some really great film over his young career. They bring him in on a 1-year deal, and I think he's going to play well, assuming that they can continue to stabilize this pass rush. I think he'll play well in Philadelphia. He will be tested though. Teams are going to avoid Quinion Mitchell. He will be tested. Ibikedi to that end in terms of that pass rush, and then Jonathan Jones, I think also a pretty shrewd addition. Jordan Davis gets the long-term deal. So as I mentioned, there's been some rumblings around Jalen Carter, whether or not he's going to be with this team long term. I think you got to figure that out. I think he's entirely too talented, right? Unless for some reason he's not available, right? Getting in trouble off the field or what have you. I think Carter is immensely talented. So I'd like to keep him on that roster. Excuse me. All right. Handful more teams left here. We got the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mentioned they traded for Michael Pittman. Exactly what the doctor ordered. Opposite DK Metcalf, right? Metcalf has demonstrated that he can be a bit of a wild card. And isn't always locked in, isn't always in control of his emotions, and that puts you in a compromising position. So adding Michael Pittman, giving him a long-term deal, made a lot of sense. Jamel Dean is a good add. You want Ramsey kind of playing that nickel. That's kind of where he lives now. So you add Dean opposite my guy, Joey Porter Jr., to kind of round out that secondary. Rico Dowdle, right? They moved off of who was it? It was um, Kenneth Gainwell. Kenneth Gainwell was signed by the Bucks via free agency, and Gainwell had a huge year. You pair Warren. Jalen Warren's a good back, but you're going to pair him up with Rico Dowdle. So I like that. I like the addition of Jaquan Brisker as well as Darnell Savage. Right? They had some question marks at the safety position. Re-up with the long-time Steeler Cam Hayward. They brought back Asante Samuel Jr. So really a concerted effort on that secondary as well. I think the Steelers have had a pretty good offseason. I think they still need to figure out what they're going to do at quarterback long term. The expectation, I think they have a pretty good feeling. Of course, no longer Mike Tomlin is no longer there, but they have a pretty good feeling that Aaron Rodgers will be back. But that's the one question mark there in Pittsburgh is what are we going to do long term at quarterback? San Francisco. I mentioned the Odigizua trade. I'm a little surprised they got a third round pick for him. Good on the Cowboys. Good on the Cowboys. I'm surprised. Now I do think he will help the Niners. Don't get me wrong, but the Nate Hobbs deal and of course Mike Evans. Mike Evans. You don't see here they brought back Trey Greenlaw as I mentioned earlier. I think that's significant. He and Kyle Warner were a really excellent duo at the second level of that defense. But Mike Evans is sorely needed in that receiving room, right? Debo, Commanders, Ayuk won't be back. None of the young guys seemingly have really stepped up. Jawan Jennings isn't there. Um, Kittle is coming off an injury. Of course, he's a tight end, but he's part of the passing game. Bringing in Mike Evans, even an older Mike Evans, I think will help this offense significantly. Take some pressure off of Christian McCaffrey. The Super Bowl champs. So according to CBS Sports, they have not signed any free agents, and it generally goes that way. It typically is about retaining your own players, and they've lost a couple, but I don't think they've lost anybody that is just completely indispensable, right? They traded at the deadline to acquire Rashid Shaheed. They re-upped with him, so he'll be the running mate there with JSN. Josh Jobe is back. Drake Thomas, of course, everybody's favorite Jake Bobo. Um, Halani. I think the main loss here, I would say, the main loss, of course, you lose Mafe, who's part of your pass rush rotation. And I think the best teams have a deep pass rush rotation. So that's not insignificant by any stretch of imagination. Of course, they lose their safety in Kobe Bryant. So again, I wouldn't summarily dismiss that loss, but I think it can be mitigated. Kenneth Walker is a bigger loss than people realize. You talk about Halani, who's a talented back, but I don't think he's Kenneth Walker. And Charbonnet, who I think is more of a plotter, is coming off of an injury. I think the Seahawks will likely be in. They don't have a lot of draft picks, so that creates a bit of consternation. I think they only have 4 picks across 7 rounds. They'll need to work the board a little bit. I think they need more draft picks. I think they'll need to work the board, but the emphasis clearly has been on retaining as many players as they possibly can. Okay, I think we got what 3 more teams here as we talk free agency frenzy, free agency fallout. We got Anzalone, Alex Anzalone going to the Bucks. Of course, I think Levante David. I think it finally has come to an end, and what a career it's been. Kenny Gainwell, you add him to Bucky Irving. I think you have kind of a similar skill. Although Irving is a superior ball carrier, Gainwell is very effective in the passing game. Al-Quadin Muhammad was a good pickup. They have a dearth of pass rush bodies. Re-upped with Cade Otton. I think that's a good move. I think he and Mayfield have a good rapport. I thought perhaps maybe they might be interested in Sadiq but they have so many other issues in terms of their pass rush in particular that I think bringing back Otton made a lot of sense. And then Sean Tucker, obviously very familiar with this team. They tendered him. The Titans entered free agency with the most cap space, and they put it to work. They put it to work. I don't think there's any name here that blows you away necessarily, but I think when you consider you have a new coaching staff, you have Robert Saleh, who wants certain types of players on his defense, right? We're transitioning, we're moving away from a 34 to a 43, right? Going in the opposite direction. Um, you have a dearth of weapons, and Wandell Robinson certainly played very well. He's familiar with your offensive coordinator system. Brian Dable, former head coach of the Giants, he's now the coordinator here in Tennessee. So you bring in Robinson to really kind of be that security blanket for Cam Ward. He still needs that number one, that guy on the perimeter, but certainly that's an improvement to your offensive weaponry. Alante Taylor and Cordell Flott, good players, right? They're not household names, but they're good football players. And I think when you think about Robert Saleh's defense, it typically doesn't feature a superstar corner. It generally doesn't feature one of those household names, a PS2, right? It just doesn't. A Trent McDuffie, it doesn't, right? So I think Taylor and Flott, assuming they get this pass rush right, and they're going to have an opportunity to, if they so choose. Um, this could be a really quick turnaround in terms of the defense. I think there's more work to do on the offensive side of the ball, but certainly on the defensive side of the ball. Now, all the tea leaves are suggesting, that the Titans view Jeremiah Love as the best player in the draft, and they're going to take him fourth overall. And I think a lot of the moves of those teams that are picking early that could be in position to select Love recognize that he's going to probably not be there. So Jeremiah Love would be a great addition, but I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced this team is just yet ready for that piece. Right? I think we may be a year early on that. And they may say, listen, he's too good for us to pass up, regardless. Right? We know there's some more work to be done with respect to the offensive line. Clearly, we're not explosive enough on the perimeter. The teams may not necessarily respect it as much, and it may be a little tough sledding for him, but he's too good in terms of what he does as a ball carrier and in the passing game. So we'll see how that plays out. The trade for Solomon Thomas makes sense too. He's played for Salah before, good interior defender. And then finally, you have the Commanders, who, as you can see, were quite busy. They entered the 2026 new league year, the legal tampering period, with a lot of money, and they spent big. They went for Adolfo Owe, and we'll see. We'll see if he lives up to that. He's certainly gotten better over the years. We're talking about a player who had no sack production at the collegiate level. but was a phenomenal athlete, right? And it was a little slow. It was a little slow, but you could see him getting better, gaining confidence in Baltimore. And then I think he really, after the trade to the Chargers, working with Jesse Mintu, who now is the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens, he really put some things together and earns a lucrative long-term deal. This is a team that, I mentioned the Bengals being historically bad defensively. The Commanders are right there with them. Very, very rough season on the defensive side of the ball. So as you can see, um, what is it? 5 of the first 6 names here. Actually, 6 of the first 7 of the first 8, 7 of the 8, all on the defensive side of the ball. All on the defensive side of the ball. Every level needs improvement, needs an injection of talent. So clearly, they understood the assignment. And despite the fact that this is a very rich defensive draft, you wouldn't be able to address all those positions. I don't think they have a full complement of picks. I think they maybe have 5, perhaps 6, but not a full complement of picks either way. They should be in position to get a good football player, though, whether it be, Ruben Bain, which would blow my mind. I think Ruben Bain is arguably the best player in the draft. Um, but for the short arms, you got Sonny Styles, you got Caleb Downs, you got David Bailey. Like they're gonna get a good one. They're gonna get a really good one. But keep addressing the defensive side of the ball. And I like what they've done thus far with Owe, Chanel, Tim Settle, Amik Robertson, Nick Cross, Chason actually played pretty well for the Patriots, and Amenahu. It's a good start. That's a good start to working it out. And I don't think they did anything crazy. Of course, Owe was kind of the big ticket item, but everybody else is around $8 million, around $8 million on average. So I think they still have quite a bit of cap room to work with. Of course, they re-up with Laramie Tunsil. It makes a ton of sense. Not sure why the Texans moved off of him. Andrew Wiley and Nick Allegretti to help protect Jaden Daniels. They'll get a healthy Jaden Daniels back. I think the Commanders, assuming they do what they need to do in this draft in terms of adding another impact defender or two, will be right back in the conversation there in 2026. No problem, Mr. C. No problem. No problem. Just watch it on the playback, man. Watch it on the playback. And I'll be sure to hit you up on the Patreon next time, give you a heads up. No worries. Just wrapping it up. So that's going to do it. That's going to do it. I just wanted to do an overview for the free agency. Obviously, there's been a lot of news. Mr. C, Seattle just focuses on bringing back as much of their own talent as possible. We'll see what they do in the draft. I'm going to get into these team-specific 7-round mock drafts, Mr. C. So just a heads up on that front. But that's it. That's going to be it for tonight. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.